you miss me? I've been out of it comatose, but the depression.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Burns, the weekly hobby list podcast with me, your host, Andrew Burns or Slow Burn from Wildfire Gaming. Back again after another week off last week, but part of that is because I've been kind of hoping to get my cousin Brett on, who we had last year to do my NFL playoff predictions with. I think we did it a little bit later in the season than I'm going to do it here this time, but. Um, yeah, I thought that it would be fun to have him on, and we still might. It's possible that we'll do a follow-up episode where we kind of compare our notes on this topic. But I did go ahead and make my predictions this week, and well, this week being I think the results are for week 9. Yeah, we've done the first 9 weeks of the NFL season, and I wanted to kind of make it at the middle section. And since I already made them, and I'm going to recording this on Saturday night on actually the morning of November 9th, so that this is kind of before the week 10 results come in on later today. Um, and I'm going to do my NFL playoff predictions just like I did last year. I didn't pull it up last year, but let me start by pulling up how I did in the my previous predictions, which I made for the 2024 season. I definitely went a little overboard on one team in particular, but it made for a fun prediction, and I'm kind of going to do probably something similar here this year. So I'll pull that up, but in the meantime, I just want to remind you that Controlled Burns is a weekly hobby list podcast with the focus on all things entertainment and pop culture, music, TV and film, video games, things of that nature, and of course, going to be covering the NFL this week. If you're into that kind of thing, you can subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you want to write into the show, you can at ControlledBurnes with an ES at gmail.com. So I pulled up my 2024 picks here. And so quickly, my predictions for the 2024 season were for the Bills to win the East, which they did, the Texans to win the South, which I think they did, the Chiefs to win the West, which of course they did, Ravens to win the North, which they did. That was actually a pretty bold prediction at the time because the Steelers were a pretty stiff competitor for them at that time. But the Ravens ended up pulling it out because the Steelers dropped one to the Bengals, as I predicted. For the wild card, I picked the Chargers, the Steelers, and the Bengals, which I think is. Oh, okay. So it ended up being the Broncos instead of the Bengals, I think, which didn't end up obviously mattering in the long term. But yeah, the Bengals was my fun pick because I was really a fan of Joe Burrow, and I was kind of hoping that things would turn out better for him than they ultimately did. But that was my AFC predictions. In the NFC, I picked the Lions in the North, of course, which was correct. The Commanders in the East, which was wrong. The Eagles won the NFC East last year, and obviously ended up winning the Super Bowl. I predicted an Eagles collapse in the second half of last year, so I just didn't trust them and their staying power. It was exactly what had happened in the 2023 season where they did collapse. So 2024, it held up, and obviously they ended up winning the Super Bowl. Although the Commanders did do better than most people would have predicted, so I was still pretty happy with how that turned out. I picked the Buccaneers in the South, which was correct. And I picked the Cardinals in the West, which was probably wishful thinking. It ended up obviously being the Rams, who I actually had at the bottom of that lineup. So that was definitely wrong. But it didn't really end up mattering too much in the long run either way. For the wild card, I had picked the Packers, the Vikings, and the Eagles. So, I mean, those teams all did ultimately obviously go to the playoffs. So, pretty good overall with my picks. But like I said, we picked a little bit later in November last time. So, I want to be hoping I'll be just as accurate this season, but with half of the season still to go, so it'll be a little bit more impressive if I can get things right. Ultimately, I predicted the Chiefs and the Lions in the Super Bowl with the Lions victory. That was incorrect, but the Chiefs did make it to the Super Bowl, and then they lost to the Eagles, so that was fun. And then, yeah, quickly for Brett's picks, he picked the Bills in the East, the Colts in the South. It was a little too early on that one. We'll try again this year. Chiefs in the West, Steelers in the North. That was incorrect. Then the Ravens, Texans, and Chargers making the playoffs. I think that was all correct. In the NFC, he picked the Lions, the Eagles, which was right, the Buccaneers, and then the Cardinals, which was wrong. Um, Packers, 49ers he thought would make the Super Bowl and or I'm sorry, the playoffs, and the Falcons he thought would make the playoffs. Neither of those came true. So he did a little bit better in the AFC. He also predicted a Lions victory in the Super Bowl, and he thought the Bills would actually make it to the Super Bowl against the Lions, which was incorrect. So for this season, I guess we're gonna. I did something similar where I picked um, the winners of each division, and then I picked the three wild cards for each conference, and then I also went ahead and made my playoff bracket for the AFC and the NFC, and ultimately my Super Bowl uh, teams, and we'll see how I do. But like I said, I've got some spicy takes for this season, so I'm looking forward to getting into it. So I think we'll start with the AFC like we did last time. Something just kind of feels right about starting the AFC, and that we'll start with the AFC East as we usually do. Last year it was no brainer with the Bills as the clearly the top team in the division. This year, though, they've got some competition. Right now, the standings as they are is Patriots are 7-2, Bills are 6-2, and the Patriots beat the Bills on October 5th, 23-20. So, based on those metrics, I would not fault people. I'm definitely seeing a lot of people picking the Patriots to win the division. I'm seeing a lot of people picking the Patriots to make a deep playoff run. They've got Drake May as their quarterback, and he's looking very impressive. However, I am still going to stick with the Bills for my pick to win the AFC East. I've got them finishing the season with a 14-3 record, which is what I had for them finishing last season. So far they've only lost two games. They've won six. So I've built in another loss for them, and then I expect them to run the table after that. Part of that is because I think they have a pretty easy schedule. They got the Dolphins today on Sunday. Other teams that they face that they should be able to beat without too much problem are the Texans and the Bengals, who I don't even know what's going on with them right now. Um, they're kind of an unpredictable team, but the Browns, the Jets. I mean, those are all very winnable games. But they do have some competition. They've got the Patriots again. I do expect them to win that game. You see that a lot where uh, division rivals will split between the two games. One will take one and one will take the other. And I reflected that a lot in my predictions for this season. They also have the Steelers, who I expect them to beat. They do have the Buccaneers and the Eagles. I think I gave them a loss against maybe the Buccaneers and a win against the Eagles, and that was kind of how or it might have been maybe vice versa. I don't even really remember but I built them in kind of expected them to lose at least one of those games with the 14-3. That's a pretty bullish prediction for them to only have one more loss. But I think it's a pretty safe prediction. I mean, yes, they lost to the Falcons, and that was like a really bad loss. That was after they had just lost to the Patriots. So they're definitely not infallible. They definitely can lose games that they're supposed to win. There's no question about it. But hopefully they've kind of gotten that out of their system, and they'll be pretty comfortable with taking the division. So for the North right now, let's skip the North. Let's move on to the West, because the West is the next division where I think it's like a pretty clear choice, which is kind of surprising to say because the West is obviously a really strong division, other than the Raiders, who are unfortunately jokes this year. But you have the Broncos, the Chargers, and the Chiefs, all with winning records, all very strong teams. The Chiefs have obviously won the division going back. Literally, I don't even remember the last time the Chiefs didn't win the division. Um, and I know that plenty of people are still predicting them to win the division this year, even though they're 5-4, because they they look very impressive at times. They have these flashes of brilliance. They're a very inconsistent team this year because you'll see them and they'll look absolutely incredible, but then you'll see them lose to the Jaguars or just kind of not look too impressive against like really good teams like the Bills last week, or obviously the Eagles and the Chargers early in the season. So with the loss to the Chargers and the Bills, and of course the Eagles and even the Jaguars, I just can't pick the Chiefs, and I just don't think that they've earned a pick in a division that's as strong as the AFC West is. So they're out for me. That leaves the Chargers and the Broncos. I do have a slight. Now, I made these predictions before Thursday night's game, which was the Broncos versus the Raiders, and I didn't actually watch that game, but I have not heard strong reviews for the Broncos, even though they did beat the Raiders 7-10. The Broncos this season remind me a little bit of the Chiefs last season, where they keep getting all these wins, and they kind of seem to raise or lower themselves depending on the quality of their opponent. If they're up against the bad teams like the Raiders or the Jets earlier this year, they don't look very impressive. But then whenever they play like a really good team, like the Eagles, who they were the first team to beat the Eagles earlier this year, um, then they look like really quite impressive. And so they're kind of a hard team to predict. But I am going to take them. They do have one game. Like I said, they play on Thursday, so I have like a little bit more insight into them than any of the other teams because they're the only team that I have that I'm predicting about that has 10 games under their belt. I believe they're the only team in the entire NFL that has 10 games under their belt right now. They're 8-2. That's very impressive. And I am going to pick them to win the division. Their upcoming opponents, they do have the Chiefs on next Sunday, so that's definitely going to tell us something. But I do, and I might have even predicted them to lose that game. I gave them a 14-3 record, so it's similar to the Bills. I'm giving them one more loss. I think I did pick them to lose against the Chiefs at least once because they actually have to play them twice since they're in the same division. They haven't played them yet. But I do expect them to kind of run the table against everybody else. They've got the Commanders, who unfortunately their season is over with the injuries to Jaden Daniels. They've got the Raiders, which should be no problem. They've got the Packers, which you know I'd like to see a Packers win there, but the Packers have just been so inconsistent this year as well that I can't trust them. And so that'll be an interesting game because the Broncos, like I said, they kind of raise or lower themselves depending on their opponent. So that could be interesting. They're going to play the Jaguars, which should be pretty entertaining. I've been very entertained by the Jaguars this season. And the Chiefs again, and then they close out the season with the regular season with the Chargers. And I do expect them to beat the Chargers after they just barely lost to them early in the season. So I'm taking the Bears with a 14-3 record in the AFC West. So that leaves the North and the South. Let's talk about the South next. Now, the South has been this kind of anomaly. It's been a really fun division to watch. So, historically, the last couple of seasons, basically ever since they got Stroud, the Texans have kind of been the team to beat in the South, but that has not been the case this year. They're at 3-5. They're just basically completely out of it at this point, which is kind of sad to see. I enjoyed watching the Texans over the last couple of years, but in with the or out with the old, in with the new, because we have the both the Jaguars and the Colts with winning records right now. I know the Colts have been definitely the biggest surprise of the season. They draft Daniel Jones, who was previously at the Giants, where they basically got rid of him because they didn't think that he was good enough to be a starter in the league, I guess. And they're going to take a chance on the new kid, but Jackson Dart, but ever since going to the Colts, he's just been extremely impressive, playing like an MVP candidate, and he's been really fun to watch. And the thing about the Colts, then this is like the biggest criticism I hear about the Colts is that they haven't beat a lot of super impressive teams. They're 7-2 as I record this. But a lot of those victories come over bad teams. You have like the Dolphins, you have the Titans, you have the Raiders, you have the Cardinals. Yeah, you have the Titans again because the Titans are obviously in the South. So not a very impressive lineup of competition there. And then whenever they do go up against a really good team, obviously they lost to the Rams and then they lost to the Steelers in this last year. And I don't even really consider the Steelers to be a really good team. Um, that said, they did beat the Broncos by just 1 point, but I remember watching that game back in week 2 and thinking that was very impressive. They really beat the crap out of the Chargers too, and the Chargers have been absolutely no joke this year. They've been a little bit inconsistent, but I think they're still a very strong team. And so those are wins that I would put more on the impressive side. So for the Colts, I'm a little bit hesitant to go all in on them just because we haven't seen Daniel Jones really be an excellent quarterback outside of this season. And so it can be a little bit tough to say for sure whether they're gonna stick the landing here in the second half of the season. And they do have some decent competition coming up. So I did end up taking them over the Jaguars because the Jaguars are kind of the same thing, only even less consistent, and they have 2 less wins right now than the Colts. So I am taking the Colts to win the division, but it is not by the same margin that I'm predicting for the East and the West with the Broncos and the Bills. I'm giving the Colts an 11-6 finish. So that's giving them leaving room for them to take four more losses right now than they have currently. So I guess that's like actually a split between four wins and four losses to finish out this season. And I do think that that is reasonable. I think they can definitely achieve that, and I think the rest of the division is weak enough to where they can still take four more losses and still win the division without too much of a problem. So they got the Falcons next week, which they should defeat. They've got the Chiefs after that, who I think I predicted to defeat the Colts. They've got the Texans, who I think the Colts should win against. Colts versus Jaguars, that's going to be huge. They actually play each other twice. Those games could end up determining the outcome of the division. So if the Jaguars end up running the game and winning both of those games, that would be absolutely huge for them. And honestly, I wouldn't hate seeing that happen. I really enjoy the Jaguars, but I do think the Colts will at least win one of those games. They got the Seahawks, who I think could definitely beat the Colts. They got the 49ers, who I think could beat the Colts too. And then they got the Texans, who I think the Colts should win against. So not a easy stretch by any means to close out the year. But like I said, even factoring in for four more losses, just splitting what they've accomplished or splitting between wins and losses, which would be a significant step down already from what they've already accomplished. I think is fair, conservative, and still leaves them with winning the division. So nothing super surprising there. The Bills over the Patriots is a take. Broncos winning over the Chargers and the Chiefs is kind of more, I think, in line with what people would probably expect um, for this season. So nothing too crazy there. And then the Colts, I think, hang on to their lead in the South. The North is where I have maybe my hottest take, and I think I'm probably not the only person to say this. So right now the Steelers clearly leading the AFC North. They're 5-3. They're the only team with a winning record. Outside of them, you have the Browns at 2-6, Ravens at 3-5, and Bengals at 3-6. So the Ravens season, people have kind of written off the Ravens season. Obviously, Lamar Jackson was injured early on in the season, and it really fell apart fast for him, which is really sad to see because that first game they had in week one against the Bills was just a barn burner, and they really should have won that game. They kind of beat the crap out of the Bills for the majority of the game, and then they let the Bills make this comeback, and it was just a complete disaster for the Ravens. And they went on to absolutely annihilate the Browns. But then they did lose to the Lions, even though it was a really close game. And then they lost to the Chiefs. And I think by this point, Lamar Jackson was hurt. And so they were just basically useless for the next couple of weeks. They got absolutely destroyed by the Texans and the Rams. Um, but then the comeback has begun with wins over the Bears on October 26th. And of course, the Dolphins last week with Lamar Jackson back just didn't stand a chance. So that leaves them at 3-5. Now, based on the fact that I'm speaking this much about the Ravens, you can probably surmise that despite the fact that they are 3-5, I'm going to pick the Ravens to win the AFC North. And basically, the way that I'm going to predict that is I'm gonna go with them not losing another game for the remainder of the season. They've got Lamar Jackson back. They're mostly up against not super great teams, particularly in the next stretch. And I think if they can build up that momentum, regain their confidence, and just motivate themselves, knowing like they really need to win all the rest of these games, I think they can return to their elite status. I think Lamar Jackson could be motivated by the fact that he didn't win MVP last year. And even though I think, basically every metric told you that he should have, other than the fact that they did lose to the Bills in the postseason, but um, like I really think that it should have been him last year. And I think that he might have a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, especially coming off of the injured reserve. So if you look at the season coming up today, they're going to be playing the Vikings. Now, if they lose to the Vikings, that's going to be a disaster for my prediction. Because if they can't beat the Vikings, then I think that they're going to have trouble against some of the teams they have later on. But I believe they can beat the Vikings with Lamar Jackson at the helm. Then they got the Browns, Jets, Bengals. That's almost like 3 weeks off. Then they kind of get into a rougher patch. They do have the Bengals again on December 14th, but they have the Steelers twice. They have the Patriots and they have the Packers. Well, those are like opponents to be feared, right? But the Ravens have always just kind of had the Steelers number. And even though the Steelers have looked more impressive this year, I still don't trust them. And I don't trust Aaron Rodgers. And I think that the Ravens could win both of those games, and that's the prediction that I've laid out here. Um, I don't trust the Packers either. I like them. I wish them well, but I can't trust them. I'm picking Lamar Jackson over the Packers. That just leaves the Patriots. I think that's going to be their toughest opponent. But I think that, especially if they actually have won like the 6 games between now and that Patriots game, I think they're going to be coming in feeling like juggernauts. And I think that there's going to be an intimidation factor against a rookie quarterback that the Patriots have. I guess he's not a rookie, but you know what I mean. Early, young quarterback going up against like an all-time great in Lamar Jackson. So I think that they can win that game too, and I think that that would be really fun to see the Ravens just like pull themselves out of obscurity for this season and just go on a run into the postseason, winning the AFC North. Now, if they had like a really strong team ahead of them, I don't think I would make a prediction this bold, but because it's only the Steelers that they have to get past, and they can still have both games against them, they can beat them twice. I think the Ravens will be able to pull it out, and will finish the regular season at 12-5. So those are my division leaders for the AFC, and that leaves 3 wild card picks. I guess we'll go ahead and start off with the Chiefs, who I have finishing at 12-5. The Chiefs have already lost 4 games, so that's giving them credit. In a lot of cases, just because of who they are and their pedigree before this season, that they're only going to have one more loss. But they have a I'm looking at their schedule now. Like it's not too bad, but it's not too good either. They definitely have some serious contenders that they have coming up. They have the Broncos, obviously, next week. This is their bye week right now, I think. Yeah, it is. So they're not playing this week as I record this. Then they've got the Broncos. They've got the Colts, which should be very interesting. But both of those games should be very interesting. They've got the Cowboys and the Texans, basically the Texas duo they should have no problem against. Then they have the Chargers, which should be I expect the Chiefs to win that game. I think they're gonna want revenge after the Chargers beat them earlier this season. And then they have the Broncos again, of course, later on. And then that just leaves one game against the Titans, one game against the Raiders. They should absolutely annihilate those teams, no problem. So kind of a half and half schedule remaining. I think they can do very well and finish 12-5. For the number 6 seed, I am picking the Patriots. Technically, I could see them coming out ahead of the Chiefs depending on how the tiebreaker breaks up because I actually have them at a 12-5 finish as well. They're currently 7-2, so that's 3 losses on their schedule, and the rest of them being wins. They have now this game that's going to happen today is going to tell us a lot about how seriously to take the Patriots. My problem with the Patriots up to this point is they've got a young quarterback who's untested, and so I can't put too much faith in them. And they also have beaten a lot of really bad teams. They did beat the Steelers and they beat the Bills, but those are the only 2 even like remotely good teams that they've beaten. And as I look back on this, I realize actually they lost to the Steelers. So the only good team that they have beaten is the Bills, and that was a really tight game. And so I think that was probably going to end up being their most impressive win this season. We're going to find out because they're going to be going up against the Buccaneers here today, and that's going to tell us a lot. I do take the Buccaneers in that game. Then they have the Jets, they have the Bengals, they have the Giants. I expect them to be able to win all those games. But then they got the Bills again. I think the Bills will be coming back for some payback, and then I do think that they'll lose to the Patriots. But they should be able to finish out the season with wins against the Jets and the Dolphins. So, pretty easy stretch coming up for the Patriots. I think they'll definitely make the postseason for the first time in quite some time. But I do not expect them to be able to hang on and beat the Bills for the overall division. So they're my number 6 seed, and then my number 7 seed, I did go with the Chargers, just hanging on in the AFC West with a 11-6 record. There's a lot of competition in the West. That I'm basically taking 3 teams from the West, which is interesting. The Chargers are a hard team to pick just because they have been inconsistent. I mean, they looked amazing in the beginning, going up against the Chiefs and just beating the crap out of them. And they beat the Broncos a couple weeks later. That was impressive. But then they went and lost to the Giants. Granted, that was in Jackson Dart's first game. They didn't necessarily know what they were going up against, so you kind of give them a little bit of a bye there. They lost to the Commanders, but the Commanders were a really good team when everybody was healthy, and so I don't fault them too much for that loss. They did lose to the Colts, but the Colts have been obviously very impressive this season. So all of the Chargers' three losses are somewhat justifiable losses, I guess, in the grand scheme of how this season has shaken out. And they also didn't get blown out in any of those games except for against the Commanders, which was just kind of a bad game for the Chargers. They've beaten everybody else that they were supposed to beat, and then beat teams that you wouldn't have expected them to be able to beat, like the Chiefs, like the Broncos, and they're coming off of two straight wins against the Vikings, who they absolutely destroyed, and the Titans, who they beat last week. And so their next game is today, actually in prime time tonight against the Steelers. That's again a game that's going to tell us a lot about the trajectory of both of those teams. But I do expect the Chargers to be able to pull that out. And then they go on a stretch where they have a lot of beatable teams. It's the Jaguars, the Raiders, who they should be able to beat. Now after that, they do have to face the Eagles and the Chiefs. So that is going to be interesting. I expect the Chiefs are going to want some comeback or some payback, and will probably win that game. It's hard to pick the Chargers over the Eagles as well. I think I'm going to go with the Eagles there. Then they have the Cowboys and the Texans, which, again, the Texas two-step, anybody can probably beat those teams the way they're looking right now. And then they close out the season against the Broncos, which could end up being a very competitive and important game for both of those teams, depending on how the division shakes out. But yeah, AFC West looking really strong, so that's why I'm picking both the Chiefs and the Chargers in the wild card there. I just think the Chiefs are going to edge them out, and the Chargers will end up being the seventh seed for the AFC West, or just the AFC in general. So that's it for the AFC. Let's transition over to the NFC now. And we'll leave the playoffs for the playoff brackets for after I've picked the teams that are going to the playoffs. So the NFC, in some ways, is a little bit less interesting than the AFC. I think the AFC has a little bit more competition in some of the divisions. The NFC has a couple of divisions where, well, I say that it has a couple of divisions where it's a pretty clear winner. I guess the only one that's like for sure clear, like there's no question, I don't think, is the Eagles winning the NFC East. And I know a lot of people have not predicted the Eagles to win, particularly whenever they went on that two-game losing streak. And there's like this sort of history that no team really is able to win the NFC East back to back in terms of history. But this year, the rest of the NFC teams are just so bad that I don't think there's any way that the Eagles, who are currently at 6-2, closest to behind them is the Cowboys at 3-5-1. I mean, there's just no way that the Eagles don't hang on and win that division again for a second time in a row. Now they do have some tough competition, no doubt about it. They do not have an easy schedule. They're going up against the Packers today. They're going up against, or I guess that's a Monday night game. They're going against the Packers. They're going up against the Lions. And they have the Cowboys and the Bears. They should be able to win those games. They got the Chargers, who that'll be a competitive game. I think the Eagles can probably win that, but it's not a guarantee. Got the Raiders, who they should destroy. Commanders, who they should destroy. And they actually have the Commanders almost back to back. They have them December 20th and January 4th. And then they have the Bills December 28th. So I'm picking the Eagles at a 14-3. So even though like they've got some decent contenders in that lineup, I'm only giving them one more loss. You can pick it against the Lions, you can pick it against the Bills. I'm personally picking it against the Bills. I think the Bills are a more consistent team this year than the Lions. But either way, I think the Eagles are going to be able to almost run the table against that lineup of opponents and finish the season 14-3 with potentially the number one seed going into the playoffs. It's hard to. I think I did pick them to have the number one seed in the playoffs this year. I that's one thing that gets a little complicated for me, I guess, where I pick which team is actually going to be the number one seed, particularly whenever there's a tie. Like in the AFC East, I've got the Bills and the Broncos at 14-3. I actually have three teams in the East with 14-3. But I think I did give the Eagles that number one seed spot, and I'll explain why when we get to that point. But yeah, 14-3 for the Eagles. Let's do. Maybe we'll do the South next because that's the next one that's kind of the least competitive. It's actually a little bit more competitive than I think people give it credit for because it's the Buccaneers lead at 6-2. The Panthers are actually only one loss or one win behind them at 5-4. Obviously, they've had one more game than the Buccaneers have had at this stage, and you know that's creates, I guess, a little bit of a statistical anomaly. But one win behind them is not bad. Especially, I don't think anybody came into this season expecting the Panthers to really be a contender in any way, considering how bad they've been in recent years. But I am going to go with the Buccaneers to hang on to that lead, and I'm giving them a 14-3 ending, so they can afford one more loss. and only one more loss for them to make that happen. They've looked very, very good this year. They've beaten a lot of teams that um, were impressive teams to beat. They've also lost a couple of games, but the games that they lost, the Eagles and the Lions, are against two, really strong teams. So it's not really that big a deal to take those losses. Those are losses that you would expect. They have not had some of the hangups that some of the other teams have had, where they lose against teams that they really should win against. The Buccaneers, they don't have the easiest schedule in the world coming up, particularly this next stretch. These next three games are going to tell us how strong the Buccaneers are going to be going into the playoffs this year, because they've got the Patriots, they got the Bills, and they got the Rams, three in a row. Those are all definitely high stakes games, should be competitive games, should be really entertaining games. But once they can get past that three stretch, the season is almost over at that point, because it's just Cardinals, Saints, Falcons, Panthers, Dolphins, Panthers. Maybe you give I didn't maybe you give the Panthers one of those wins, because that does happen a lot with, like I said earlier, when you had division rivals going at it. But the Buccaneers have just looked so much more consistent than the Panthers this year. I just had to give the Buccaneers both of them. In terms of where their one loss is going to come from, I can't remember if I accounted for it against the Bills or if I accounted for it against the Rams. Probably the Bills. I'm giving the Bills a lot of credit here, despite the two losses that they've had so far. And no matter how you want to hash it out, the Buccaneers definitely should win the majority of those games. So I'm giving them a 14-3 finish as well. And then we'll take a look at the North next and leave the West for last, since the West has three teams with 6 wins, which is pretty cool. The North has three teams with 5 wins. You have the Packers at 5-2-1, currently leading the division. That one tie is keeping them ahead of the Lions and the Bears, who are both 5-3. And then you have the Vikings at 4-4. So very competitive division. The North was obviously very competitive last year. We had 3 teams from the North make it to the playoffs, and all of them were gone by the end of round one. So obviously, but all those teams are going to be very motivated to do better if they can make it to the postseason this year. I don't think necessarily. Well, who could say? Maybe we'll see a repeat where we have 3 teams from the NFC North going into the playoffs. We'll talk about that in a minute. But in terms of who's going to win the division, I know that the Packers are on top right now, and they've also beaten like pretty much everybody in the division at this point. I mean, you look at they beat the crap out of the Lions in the first game, their first game of the season, and then they've also beaten. Is that the only division rival they've had? Beat the Commanders, lost to the Browns, tie with the Cowboys, beat the Bengals, beat the Cardinals, beat the Steelers, lost to the Panthers. So yeah, so they got a lot of division matchups left to go. I can't. Those losses to the Panthers and the Browns and tie with the Cowboys. I mean, that's pretty bad too, considering how bad the Cowboys are. I just can't trust the Packers, even though they're on top of the division. If I was going to pick a team to support in the NFC North, who I would like to see win, it obviously would be the Packers. If you remember last year, Brett and I talked about how the Packers are. He grew up as a Packers fan. He was actually named after Brett Favre. And his dad is from the Green Bay area and is just a huge Packers fan. But I just can't trust them this year. I hate to say it. So that leaves the Lions, the Bears, and the Vikings. Technically, you could pick any of them. They're Lions and the Bears are tied, and the Vikings are just one game behind them. Last year, obviously, the division was won by the Lions, and I am going to pick the Lions again this year. The Bears, it would be impossible to pick just because they've been so inconsistent. I think they've been better than people expected, but you can't really trust them based on just historical precedent, quite honestly. And then the Vikings, they've been talking about inconsistent. They've been super inconsistent. They finally decided to start playing McCarthy, and they have looked better since doing that. They actually beat the Lions last week, so that was really impressive, and maybe will give you pause about picking them from if you're trying to pick the winners about picking the Lions. But I do think that out of the four, they are the strongest for me, based on their schedule and based on what they've shown for me this year. And I think part of that is I think they're going to be motivated to get wins back against these teams that they've lost against. I think they're going to beat the Vikings whenever they play them again. especially having played against JJ McCarthy now. They kind of know what to expect. And I think they're going to be very motivated to beat the Packers after the Packers embarrassed them in week one. People were already like writing off the Lions after that week one performance until they bounced back in a major way. So I do expect them to beat both the Packers and the Vikings whenever they meet them again. They've already beaten the absolute brakes off the Bears, 52-21. I cannot see them doing anything other than beating the Bears again. So that's three wins for the remainder of the games they have within their division. Then for everybody else, that I certainly expect them to beat the Commanders today without Jaden Daniels. I expect them to be able to beat the Giants. I expect them to be able to beat the Cowboys. I expect them to be able to beat the Steelers, quite frankly. Where they're going to run into a little bit of trouble is they do go up against the Eagles on November 16th. They go up against the Rams on December 14th. And those are definitely two games where you could certainly see them dropping one or both of those games. And then they have the Steelers on December 21st. I find the Steelers to be a very hard team to predict, but I think I gave the Lions credit there. So based on my predictions, I've only given them one more loss. Probably it was probably against either the Eagles or the Rams. I don't remember, but basically kind of accounting that they're probably going to lose at least one of those games. They could lose them both, and things might look a little bit more interesting for the division. Obviously, any loss that the Lions record at this point is going to be notable with the division that tight. But I do expect their division rivals to lose, just quite frankly, just lose more games than they will. And I think in the second half of the season, they're just going to kind of more and more run away with that number one spot. So, with that in mind, I am picking the Lions with a 13-4 schedule. I do think they're going to be the number 4 seed in the NFC. I think the other three teams are more impressive than them in the other divisions, but I am giving them the win in the division. So that just leaves the NFC West, which obviously is a very impressive division. The Seahawks, the Rams, and the 49ers, all with 6 wins. And then you have the Cardinals at 3-5, who are just a complete joke. This is a really fun division. Like all those teams have been really fun to watch. Obviously, um, Brock Purdy has been injured for like the majority of the season, or at least not been playing the majority of the season. They've been going with Mac Jones instead. Jones has looked excellent for the 49ers, and in some ways, I'm wondering if they're kind of leaving Brock Purdy out just to keep playing with Mac Jones just because he's been looking so good. So that's been very interesting to see. They've actually beaten the Seahawks and the Rams up to this point, and so if you want to put your money on the 49ers, that's not an unfair bet in that division. But the Seahawks and the Rams have also looked very impressive outside of their games with the 49ers. The Seahawks are coming off of that game last week where they just absolutely annihilated the Commanders and basically just ended their season. So that was impressive. They've also mostly, I guess, beaten, or really entirely beaten teams that they should beat, and then the games that they've lost have been really close. They obviously lost in week one to the 49ers, and then they beat the crap out of the Steelers, destroyed the Saints, beat the Cardinals, lost to the Buccaneers, but only by 3 points. Beat the Jaguars, beat the Texans, absolutely annihilated the Commanders. So they've been looking very good. And I like the Seahawks a lot. I think they might be, in some ways, the most interesting option. And then you have the Rams, who they've looked very good as well. They lost that game in overtime against the 49ers, which was a disgrace. And I really think, I mean, that was just a horrendously officiated game. So I don't know if I would put too much stock in that. I do think that they will be motivated to beat the 49ers next time. And they've destroyed a lot of teams, particularly lately. They've just been, the strength of their wins has been very impressive. They absolutely annihilated the Saints, the Jaguars, and the Ravens by multiple scores in the last 3 weeks. They also are one of the only teams to beat the Colts so far. And then, of course, they beat the Texans and the Titans early in the season. The other loss coming to the Eagles. And then, like I said, they lost to the 49ers. So between the Seahawks and the Rams, it's like that's kind of who you have to pick if you're me. They are obviously, both of those teams have one less loss than the 49ers, and I do expect them both, even though they both lost to the 49ers, I expect them to get those wins back later in the season. So if I'm going to eliminate the 49ers right now, especially with some of the injury stuff that they've been dealing with, got to pick between the Seahawks and the Rams. I think both teams will make the playoffs. I think there's a it's possible that the 49ers will make the playoffs as well. But I'm gonna go with the Seahawks for my win, for my prediction here with a 14-3 record. I think it part of that is I just think it makes for a really sometimes it might seem ridiculous to say this, but sometimes in the NFL, you'd be surprised how many predictions you can go off of based on just sort of storylines. And while Matthew Stafford and leading the Rams is a very impressive, especially at his age, is very impressive. I think for this to be the first season for Sam Darnold at the Seahawks is kind of a better story, and they've just looked so impressive in the last few weeks. I just got to go with them. And then I think if you look at the strength of their schedule, I think the Seahawks just kind of have the easier schedule remaining. The Seahawks have the Cardinals next, who I definitely expect them to defeat. Then we have the Rams. That's going to be a really interesting game. They have not faced the Rams yet, so that's going to tell us a lot. If the Rams come out and they absolutely smoke the Seahawks, and by all means, you go with the Rams as your team for the division. But I'm expecting them to split those wins because they're so evenly matched. I think the Seahawks will take one, the Rams will take one. But I do think the Seahawks are going to be able to beat the Titans. I think they're going to be able to beat the Vikings, the Falcons, the Panthers, and I think they're going to get their win back against the 49ers. They do have the Colts on December 14th. That should be really interesting. I do think the Seahawks could beat the Colts. And if they do, then that's going to really help with their image, I guess, going into the playoffs. So I don't know I really don't know what the sort of takeaway is in the wider sphere of NFL predictors. I think I know a lot of people are taking the Rams, but I know that a fair number are probably taking the Seahawks as well. And I think the Seahawks. Another thing about the Seahawks is they've just been so close to making the playoffs, and yet so far the last couple of seasons, I think the fact that they've got this new quarterback, it's really working for them. And they just look so strong. I just think they're highly motivated to not only make the playoffs but actually win the division and come into the playoffs with an advantage. And so I think that's what's going to happen here. I'm giving them a 14-3 finish on the season. So that's the Eagles in the East with 14-3, Buccaneers in the South with 14-3, Seahawks in the West with 14-3, and then the Lions in the North with 13-4. So for my three wild cards for the NFC, first off, for the 5 seed, I am going to take the Rams. Let's take a look at them and their schedule. I factored in a couple more losses for the Rams and have them finishing 11-6. I do have them winning. Obviously, the majority of the games they have left, they do have the 49ers, who, like I said, I expect them to beat. They have the Seahawks twice. I expect them to win one of those games. They got the Panthers, which should be no problem. The Cardinals, which should be no problem. The Falcons, which should be no problem there. Actually, they got the Cardinals twice, so they should definitely beat them twice. Where they might run into a little bit of trouble, they do have the Buccaneers, who I think that'll be a really competitive. I think those should be two very evenly matched teams, two very strong quarterbacks, very unpredictable game. I think the Rams could definitely lose that game. Um, I think the Buccaneers could definitely lose that game too. So it really could go either way. Then they have the Lions. That's going to be a tough game for them as well. Um, the Lions have been very strong this year. The Rams have been very strong this year. Very hard to predict, but I think in both cases the in terms of my predictions, I gave it to their opponents there. So I did give it to the Buccaneers and I gave it to the Lions. So Rams can win those games, then I think they definitely have a very strong shot to win the division over the Seahawks. But I do think they have a little bit more competition than the Seahawks. That's why I put them at the number one wild card, but number 5 seed overall, not quite beating the Seahawks for the division. My number 6 seed, I'm going ahead and I'm going with the 49ers as well. The 49ers are clearly motivated. They've been very impressive despite their injuries. They didn't make the playoffs last year, and so I think that they've definitely got a fire in them to correct that for this year. They've got kind of an up and down schedule remaining as well. Obviously, they're about to go up against the Rams, who I think they will lose to. But they should be able to beat the Cardinals. They should be able to beat the Panthers. They should be able to beat the Browns. They should be able to beat the Titans. That's an easy stretch. But then the final 3 games, that's where we're going to really find out where the 49ers are going to land. They got the Colts, they got the Bears, they got the Seahawks. They should definitely be able to beat the Bears. But it's not a guarantee considering how sort of, if they catch the Bears on a good night, like watch out. But that should be interesting. The Colts have been so good. I am gonna give it to the Colts. I'm gonna give it to the Seahawks too, because I think, like I said, I think they're gonna get their win back. 49ers, like I said, for sure in the fight. Really, all three of those teams are contenders to ultimately win the division. But I gotta go. I gotta pick somebody at the end of the day. So I'm going Seahawks. Rams, 49ers, I actually have both at 11-6. So that's gonna be tough. Like I don't even know what the if both of them have like the same number of wins losses in the division, which is what I predict. I don't actually even know. I guess it would go to strength of wins at that point. So that'll be interesting to see. I think I have them both beating the Cardinals twice, and then one win against the and one loss against the other two teams. So I guess that's a 4-2 record. So we'll see what comes out of that. But I do think that all three of those teams are going to end up making the playoffs. My number seven, so the seventh seed in the NFC was a really tough one to predict. There were multiple contenders here. The Packers are obviously a big contender. They've been very inconsistent, so it could go either way. The Bears and the Vikings are obviously in it. The Panthers could be in it if they really, continue their stretch of beating teams that they're really not supposed to beat. Out of those teams, and looking at their schedule, the team that I ended up going with is actually the Bears. I don't even know the last time that they made the playoffs, so I think they'd be highly motivated if they really are in the running, which I think they are. And they're doing better at this stage of the season than I think a lot of people, certainly I, expected them to do. They do not have an easy schedule ahead, so um, it easily could be the Packers, and honestly, I hope it is. Like I said, I'm definitely more of a Packers fan than the Bears, but I just can't trust the Packers, and I have them coming out with even more losses because they don't have an easy schedule by any means either. So for the Bears coming up, they've got the Giants, who I think they can beat. They've got the Vikings, who I think they can beat. Um, Especially since the Vikings beat them in a really close game earlier this season. I think the Bears could get that one back. They've got the Steelers, who are beatable. I don't know if they actually will beat the Steelers, but they are beatable. They have the Eagles, who, that's tough. I don't know if they'll be able to beat the Eagles. The Packers, I actually think that they will be able to beat the Packers. They actually have them twice. I expect them to win at least one of those games. I don't think they'll probably win both. If they do, then they're for sure making the playoffs. And if the Packers win both those games, they could very easily make the playoffs instead of the Bears. So it's going to be very competitive. It's going to be really fun to watch those games, the Packers versus the Bears. Those are going to be huge, and obviously they're division rivals going back to like the Stone Ages. So that should be really entertaining. They have the Browns, who they should obviously destroy. Then they have the 49ers and the Lions to close out the season. Tough games. Tough games. I think the 49ers are the easier opponent of the two. The Lions just absolutely destroyed them earlier this season, so there might be a psychological advantage there for the Lions. It's not impossible for the Bears to try to get that win back, but man, I can't pick them against the Lions whenever they got beat that bad. And the 49ers, I mean, who even knows what that team looks like at that stage of the season, but I think it's a very real possibility that the 49ers, I mean, they beat a lot of good teams this year. I think I'd have to give that one to the 49ers as well. But I have the Bears finishing it up at a 9-8 for the seventh seed. So they're definitely my weakest team in the playoff picture because for the seventh seed in the AFC, I've got the Chargers at 11-6. But I am giving it to the Bears by the skin of their teeth at 9-8. Let's see if they can prove me right. Okay, so those are the 14 teams making the playoffs. Let's take a look at the bracket. We'll go back to the AFC and look at the AFC bracket first. For week 1, my games are the Broncos versus the Chargers. The Broncos the second number 2 seed, Chargers the number 7 seed. Patriots versus the Ravens, with the Ravens is the number 3 seed, Patriots is the number 6 seed. I don't know if a lot of many people would predict it to be that way right now, but that's what I'm going with. And then the 4 and 5 seeds, the Colts and the Chiefs. So for those games, I'm going to give the wins to the Broncos over the Chargers. The Broncos have just been more consistent this year. Like I said, they just managed to pull out these wins. And I think most critically, um, the Chargers beat the Broncos earlier this year, and so they're going to be highly motivated to get that win back, especially with it being a playoff game. I trust the Broncos in the playoffs more than I trust the Chargers. I'm going to go with the Broncos in that game. And the Patriots versus the Ravens. That's going to be a really interesting game if that actually ends up coming to pass. Obviously, I have the Patriots in there. I can't. Do they? I can't remember if the Patriots are on the Ravens' schedule. They are. They are on December 21st. So it could be a repeat of that game. Uh, I wouldn't be surprised if the Patriots do manage to take one of those wins. So if the Patriots win in the regular season, I could see the Ravens coming back, vice versa for sure. But at the same time, especially in the playoffs, I say this. I think I'm going to give it to the Ravens just because they have a lot more experience in the playoffs. That said, the Ravens have been very disappointing in the postseason. And so if you want to pick the Patriots there, I can understand that. But the Patriots are just Drake May is just untested. That team is already exceeding everybody's expectations. I think the season is still a big win for them if they make it to week one of the playoffs and lose to a great team like the Ravens. I'm giving it to the Ravens, partially for storyline reasons, I will admit, because they just have looked so hopeless for the majority of the season. A lot of people think the season is over for the Ravens. And I think it would be really interesting if that happens. But either way, either team could definitely win that. And we have the Chiefs with the Colts. For me, this is a pretty easy prediction. I got to go with the Chiefs. I know the Colts are fun to watch. It's exciting. I'm really happy for Daniel Jones. But when you get to the playoffs, the Chiefs are just a completely different animal. And even though it would be an away game for the Chiefs, they don't give a crap about that. About home, away, whatever. They win. They get wins no matter what. You got to go with the Chiefs in that game. So that takes me for the Broncos, Ravens, and Chiefs. Moving on, week two we would have the Chiefs versus the Bills based on this match, the way that my bracket has lined up, and then the Broncos versus the Ravens. For this game, I've got to go with the Chiefs over the Bills. How can you not? The Chiefs have beaten the Bills in perpetuity in the postseason. Maybe the Bills can change that trajectory. I would love to see this game again this year in the postseason. That would be one of my most anticipated games to see if the Bills could actually pull it out for once. But until they can actually do it, I can't pick them. I can't pick them to do that. And plus, if I'm not mistaken, let me look at the Chiefs versus the Bills here. Do they play each other in the regular season? Oh wait, they did play each other in the regular season last year, and who or last week, and who won? The Bills, of course. It was a close game. They just That's just all it is how it happens. The Bills beat them in the regular season and then they lose in the postseason. I think that's exactly what's going to happen if they face each other again this year. So prove me wrong, Bills. We'll see what you can do. And then that's the Broncos versus the Ravens, and this is a situation where both teams have been disappointing in the postseason. Obviously, the Broncos just barely squeaked in last year and lost. Ravens make it to the playoffs and then they kind of choke against really good teams. But this time, I think I'm going to go with the Ravens again, partially for storyline reasons, but also because the Broncos are a beatable team. Like, yes, they keep getting all these wins, but their wins against unimpressive teams are unimpressive. They're always like really close, like this game that we just had with the Raiders, the game earlier in the season with the Jets. They're definitely beatable. I think if the Ravens come in, especially if they start not taking the Ravens seriously. Although, of course, if the Ravens make it this far, people are definitely going to be taking them seriously. But the Ravens just have a lot more experience in the playoffs. Bo Nix has plenty of playoff runs left in him. The pressure is nowhere near as high on him as it is on Lamar Jackson. So in that sense, you could say, well, then maybe Lamar Jackson will crumble under the pressure. For this season, I'm picking Jackson to not crumble under the pressure and make it to the championship game as he did a couple of years ago against Chiefs. So then we have a rematch for the championship game, Chiefs versus Ravens. I'm taking the Ravens. I'm going to take the Ravens to go to the Super Bowl. I know that that's an insanely bold prediction. That's part of the fun here, is I liked having my bold prediction last season with the Bengals making the playoffs and going all the way. I don't think I had them going to the Super Bowl, but having them make a playoff run. I'm doing the same thing for the Ravens this year, except for I am actually predicting for them to make it to the Super Bowl. The Chiefs have to come back down to earth eventually. I mean, they've been in the last three Super Bowls. They won two of them. And I think this is their comeback down to earth season. Yes, they've looked impressive at times. They're 5-4. They're a beatable team this year. Now they were looking like a beatable team in 2023 too. So I do recognize that. And then of course they ended up winning it all. But I think this year, with the strength of what we're seeing in the AFC, I still, like I said, they're the Chiefs. I still think they're going to go deep. I think they'll make it to the championship game. But I think it's finally going to catch up to them in that game. They're not getting any younger, particularly Travis Kelce. And, obviously, if the Ravens actually make it this far, they're going to be so motivated, and especially against the Chiefs. I think this is where they finally, the Chiefs are weak enough for the Ravens to break through, and the Ravens make it to the Super Bowl for the AFC. That leaves the NFC. Let's go back to week one of the playoffs for the NFC. We have Based on the way I drew up my bracket, we have the Buccaneers as the number 2 seed against the number 7 Bears. We have the number 3 Buccaneers. Oh, I'm sorry. The number 3 Seahawks against the number 6 49ers. And then we have the number 4 Lions against the number 5 Rams. So for this lineup, I have pretty clear winners in all these cases. I definitely would expect if the Buccaneers are going up against the Bears to get the win. Buccaneers have looked much more impressive this season. I think the Bears, if they make it to the playoffs, will be pretty lucky to get there. If they won a game in the playoffs, that would just be earth shattering for that franchise. I don't think it's going to happen against a team as good as the Buccaneers. So I'm going with the Buccaneers there. 49ers versus the Seahawks. We already saw the 49ers beat them once this season. I obviously think that the Seahawks will win in the rematch. In the playoffs, I've got to go with the Seahawks again. They're just going to be, I just think they're going to be, have more fire in their bellies, especially with Darnold at the helm. Now he choked in the playoffs last year, so if you want to go on precedence and say that, I could see that happening. But at a certain point, I like the Seahawks so much more than the 49ers that I've just got to pick them, and just kind of hope for the best. Maybe the 49ers will get past them and end up getting a win there, but I'm gonna go with the Seahawks on that one. They 49ers barely beat them earlier this year. They're more beat up than the Seahawks. I'm gonna give it to the Seahawks, and I think that that might be exactly what um, Darnold needs going up against an opponent he knows, an opponent that he knows he can beat, if of course they win later on in the regular season. Then the Rams versus the Lions. The Lions are choke artists in the playoffs. The Rams have been very strong this year. I'm taking the Rams, especially. I think it's going to be there will be a really interesting playoff game. Obviously, with Matthew Stafford could go into the Rams after his stint at the Lions and kind of get a little bit of revenge there in that game. So yeah, I'm gonna go with the Rams over the Lions in that game, especially considering that the Lions knocked the Rams out of the wild card in uh, early in the 2024 season. And the Lions beat them in overtime in the 2024 season as well. So the Rams are due a win over the Lions for sure. Okay, so that's a Buccaneers win, a Seahawks win, and a Rams win. Let's go to week 2, where we have the Rams versus the Eagles and the Buccaneers versus the Seahawks. To survive a bye week in the playoffs, you have to be a really good team. I know it takes a lot of work to get there, but I do think that those teams end up getting cold more often than not and end up choking. We saw obviously that with the Lions last year. I don't think the Eagles are good enough to survive the bye week if they are the number 1 seed this year, which is what I have predicted. And by the way, if you want to talk about that a little bit about why I predicted them to get the number 1 seed, because it's obviously going to be really close against the Buccaneers and the Seahawks. Well, the Eagles already beat the Buccaneers, and the Buccaneers have already beaten the Seahawks. So if you just kind of go by that, I think if there's a tie, the Eagles are going to win that tie. Are going to win the tiebreaker there, and that gives them the number 1 seed. But then whenever you come into the playoffs cold against the Rams, who, especially if they beat the Lions, are going to be hot as hell. I think you got to take the Rams in that game. So I am taking the Rams to beat the defending Super Bowl champions. We had the Buccaneers versus Seahawks. Awesome game. That would be a really great one to see. Obviously, we already saw it and it was really close. The Buccaneers got the win. I have the Seahawks taking that win back against the Buccaneers if they meet in the playoffs. So that's Rams, Seahawks for the championship game. Divisional rivals would be an awesome game. I expect them to split wins in the regular season. We haven't seen them play each other yet, so it's super hard to predict. But even though, and I have the Seahawks, remember, as the number 1 seed, or not the number 1 seed, but higher seed than the Rams, though winning the division. But this is where I think maybe you start to see the inexperience, or not really inexperience, but the pressure get to Sam Darnold. And I think it'd be really hard. I'd like to see a Seahawks win against the Rams, but Matthew Stafford has been there before. He's been to the top of the mountain. He's been to the top of the mountain with the Rams. In 2022, I think it is certainly possible for him to do it again, especially if they're going up against a team that they know really well in the Seahawks, a team that I expect them to be able to beat at least once this season. I'm going to pick them to win the championship game for the NFC, and that leaves the Super Bowl as the Rams versus the Ravens, which is obviously a bold prediction considering the Ravens are currently 3-5. I recognize that. But for storyline purposes, and I think if you want to pick the Rams in that game, no problem. Obviously, Matthew Stafford's been to the top of the mountain; he's done it before. But I think Lamar Jackson, if they fight their way to this point where they're actually in the Super Bowl, it's just hard to imagine them finding a way to choke. That's the Ravens. They're choke artists. They, if any team could do it, it probably would be them. But at a certain point, I feel like they've got to have enough things go their way to where they can get the win, even when the lights are on brightest. And it makes for a fun story. People will talk about that for years and years to come if they can actually pull it off. So it's the more fun prediction. I'm going with the Ravens to win the Super Bowl this year for the NFL, the 2025 NFL season. Bold prediction, no doubt about it. It'd be really fun to see. But, the NFL has been really fun this year regardless. It's been very hard to predict. A lot of really good teams splitting wins, teams losing games are supposed to win, teams winning games are supposed to lose. Very unpredictable. Nobody has like just a run away with it record. Every team has at least 2 losses. So I think that this season in a lot of ways is more difficult to predict. And so doing an earlier prediction than I did last year is fun, and having a tougher season to predict than last year's is fun. So I'm looking forward to seeing how these predictions pan out. And who knows, by the end of today, it is November 9th, Sunday, game day as I record this. Maybe my predictions are going to look very foolish and it's going to be a disaster, but probably not, because it's early on enough in the season where any loss today for these teams will be recoverable, except for maybe the Ravens. They really do need to win the remainder of their game. So that Ravens versus Vikings game today is going to be very important for my predictions, and very important for the Vikings if they want to fight their way to the playoffs, because they're not out of it either. I didn't talk about them too much, but that NFC North is wide open, and I think that 7th seed in the NFC is pretty wide open as well. So that should be interesting to see as well. But I've talked enough about football for one evening. Thank you for joining me on the podcast this week. If you're an NFL fan, which I imagine you are, if you've made it this far, please write in with your predictions, and I'll be happy to read them on the air. You can write into the podcast for any reason, of course. ControlledBurnes with an ES at gmail.com. If you enjoy the show, you can like, review, star it, whatever you can do on the podcast platform of your choice. So that's it for this week. Until next time, keep it warm.